Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to our second virtual summit entitled Economic Recovery, Is There Light at the End of the Tunnel? Presented by the Shareholders Association of the Philippines, or SharePHIL, and co-presented by CIBI Foundation. My name is Jimmy Ismael, a trustee of both SharePHIL and CIBI Foundation, and I will be your host this afternoon. It has been almost 5.5 months since our government implemented the lockdown to contain the spread of the virus that causes COVID-19. We have witnessed its devastating effect on the economy and the lives of millions of Filipinos. The statistics are daunting, as we have never seen the economy contract this much since the 80s, with GDP growth rate registering at negative 16.5% in the second quarter, the second lowest in ASEAN 6, resulting in a string of business failures, which in turn caused a massive increase in unemployment. Consumption and investment spending tanked alongside the slump in exports and imports, as the health crisis quickly turned into a crisis of confidence among consumers and businessmen. All these threaten the economic gains we have made over the last decade unless we swiftly address the issues and put the economy back in shape. The task of reviving the economy requires a massive effort and necessitates a concerted move between the government and the private sector. It is in this context that we are holding a sequel to our first summit in April, which was entitled Rise as One, where our speakers discussed the salient provisions of the Arise Bill, an economic stimulus act authored by the House of Representatives. Today's second summit is intended to follow up on the progress of the various economic stimulus packages that have been drawn up, identify what else is needed to revive the economy, and discuss how we can ensure the swift implementation of these measures to jumpstart the economy. History has repeatedly shown that crises of this proportion eventually end. These crises are usually followed by a period of significant economic activity and prosperity. The inevitable economic recovery will happen, as the disruptions caused by this crisis usually lead to humankind adapting to the change and transforming their ways in a manner that leads to significant breakthroughs in technology and innovation. So, it is not a question of whether economic recovery will happen, but rather when it will happen, and more importantly, how we can make it happen. We look forward to hearing the answers to these questions from our distinguished set of speakers this afternoon as they address our theme, economic recovery. Is there light at the end of the tunnel? Before we start with our program, please join us in an invocation to be led by Mr. Santi Dumlao, one of the trustees of CIBI Foundation. This will be followed by the singing of the Philippine National Anthem. Santi?
Thank you, Jimmy. May I lead all of us in an opening prayer. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Almighty God, we invoke your holy presence as we meet this afternoon. Be the one to preside over our virtual meeting. Be the one to guide the lips of our speakers. Be the one, Lord, to open the ears of our listeners. Be the one to open our minds to search for and find answers in this time of great uncertainty. Be the one to unite our hearts, to always work together, to care for each other, to pursue what is right and just, to always seek your will, that in all things you may be glorified. Be the one that indeed light at the end of the tunnel, evolve
Thank you, and we apologize for the technical difficulties. We now call on Chair Evelyn to deliver her opening remarks.
Thank you, Jimmy. Good afternoon and welcome, fellow members of SharePHIL and CIBI. Good afternoon, friends.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
The past 5 months have drastically changed our own lives. Change normally takes much time before this becomes acceptable. But in the case of changes imposed upon us by this pandemic, the virus, and were are enough motivation for us to alter our lifestyles and our imagine our typical household. How has this pandemic affected us? If we are employed and lucky, we may still be getting our full pay. Many, though, have got a pay cut or a temporary suspension of employment, or worse, a notice of termination. Dressing up for work is no longer mandatory. Since work from home, there are no social or business events to attend to, as everything is done through video conferencing. Eating out, business lunches, family dinners, restaurants are rare, if at all. Entertainment is mostly confined to Netflix, YouTube, or Facebook. Out-of-town trips to Boracay or other resorts are hard to do. Overseas trips, cruises, or holidays abroad now seem like history. Imagine the effects of these behavioral changes on businesses, their employees, their supply chain, their creditors, the government. These days, shopping is no longer our favorite pastime. Stores, retail shops, shopping malls are the first victims of the quarantine. Restaurants, destination resorts, tour and travel agencies are slowly going out of business if they haven't yet closed. Airlines, hotels, cruise lines are bleeding, and many of their facilities have been mothballed. Movie houses, events place, they have downsized, if not suspended their operations. We seldom go out, and our vehicles don't leave our garages, so we don't fuel up as often. Religious services are not allowed or limited, so donations to churches and charity are drying up. But it is not all bad news. The business of telcos must be booming because of wider bandwidth requirements by work from home people. Water consumption, alcohol, and disinfectant of residential consumers must have skyrocketed. Private hospitals are full and turning down admissions. Online businesses, especially food and delivery services, have sprouted everywhere. Every household, whether rich or poor, has been impacted negatively by this pandemic. We know what this has done to our economy. This is the reason why we are holding this summit today. So far, our government has implemented Bayanihan 1, and we are about to see Bayanihan 2 unfold. We have obediently followed the IATF protocols during all types of queues. These are what we have done so far to stimulate or prevent the collapse of the economy and contain the pandemic. How about tomorrow? How can we get out or learn to live with this pandemic and start our recovery process? SharePHIL and CIBI are proud to bring you the experts who will evaluate what we have done right or wrong and what they suggest is the best economic recovery plan to jumpstart and sustain our economic revival. We are hopeful Our speakers will all agree that the sun will come out tomorrow and that the light at the end of the tunnel, we pray, will be the enlightened Filipino who will love his country dearly. Thank you very much for joining us today and have a good afternoon.
Thank you, Chair Evelyn. May we now ask Mr. Mon Fernandez, Chairman of the Summit Committee of SharePHIL, to introduce our keynote speaker.
Good afternoon, SharePHIL and CIBI and friends. It's my honor to introduce to you our keynote speaker. Our keynote speaker is the Assistant Secretary and Acting Head of the Strategy, Economics, and Results Group of the Department of Finance. He leads a multidisciplinary team working on the comprehensive tax reform program and other related economic reforms. He also serves as head of communications and spokesperson for the department. Previously, he was head of public policy at Ayala Corporation and head of communication at the International Rice Research Institute. He was also the governance specialist at the World Bank in Washington, D.C. Our speaker holds advanced degrees in the University of Pennsylvania and Harvard University, which he attended as a Fulbright Scholar. He received an AB in Communication, cum laude, at the Ateneo de Manila, and was one of the 1999 10 outstanding students of the Philippines. As a trivia, our speaker is a good singer. Music fans who grew up in the 90s would remember our speaker as one of the members of the group Smoky Mountain. Ladies and gentlemen, Assistant Secretary Tony Lambino.
Thank you, Sir Mon. Good afternoon, everybody. And on behalf of Secretary Dominguez, thank you for having me and for inviting me to share a few key features of the recovery plan. I'd also like, of course, to say that I am honored to be part of this event. So many of the leading lights in terms of knowing what to do in a time like this are already on the panel. So I look forward to learning from our panelists this afternoon as well. The panel will include, of course, former Socioeconomic Planning Secretary Dr. Habito, former Socioeconomic Planning and DBM Secretary Neri, former BSP Deputy Governor Diwa Guinigundo. DG Diwa, as we were singing the national anthem, I turned to the left because right outside my window is the flag of the BSP. And I come to work every morning, and that is what I see, and it's a very inspiring sight. Mrs. Evelyn Singson, Chairperson of the Shareholders Association of the Philippines. Mr. Fred Parungao, President of SharePHIL and Chair of the Credit Information Bureau Incorporated Foundation. Mr. Mon Fernandez, Vice President of SharePHIL and Summit Chair. Mr. Jimmy Ismael, Programs Chair of CIBI Foundation. Santi Dumlao, CIBI Trustee. Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, again, a good afternoon to everybody. The Philippines, like most, if not all of the world, is grappling with the COVID-19 pandemic. No one was fully prepared for the impact of this crisis, but the administration did not shirk from its responsibility to protect citizens. We quickly took stock of the situation and responded to it. We were the first country in the ASEAN to impose a lockdown in March to save lives and protect our communities. The 9% GDP contraction in the first semester of this year is a consequence of the lockdowns imposed in some parts of the country again to save lives and protect communities. While costly, these lockdowns were necessary. Without the lockdown, the infection rate would have been much higher, overwhelming our hospitals and isolation facilities. The lockdown enabled us to reinforce our healthcare system to save lives. These measures helped prevent an estimated 1.3 to 3.5 million infections, according to university-based researchers working with the IATF.
Here now, can you see me?
The latest data suggests
All right,
that
okay.
over 1%, a little over 1% of all COVID-19 cases in the country are severe or critical. Our mortality ratio, on the other hand, is at 2.9 people per 100,000 population. The UK and Spain are at around 62, Sweden at 57, and the United States at 54 people per 100,000. Despite not having the largest stimulus package, and even with one of the strictest lockdowns in the world, the Philippines performed better than some economies owing to its fiscal strengths. This is not the usual economic crisis where a larger stimulus package translates into a milder recession. Some economies retreated significantly despite massive stimulus packages. While we sustained a deep economic contraction in the first semester of the year, our challenges are not unique. Among our credit rating peers, first semester numbers show estimated contractions of 10.6% in Mexico, 8.9% in Italy, 8.2% in Portugal, and 1.2% in Indonesia. We are not alone in our struggles, although we remain confident that the fiscal and macroeconomic strengths with which we entered 2020 will continue to provide us with solid footing as we confront our economic challenges. Last year, we brought down our debt to GDP ratio to a historic low at 39.6%. With bold tax reform measures and improved tax administration, our revenue effort rose to 16.1% of GDP, the highest in 2 decades. Despite the delayed passage of last year's national budget, we managed to increase our infrastructure investments to 5.4% of GDP, or double the average infrastructure spending to GDP for the past 50 years. Under the rice tariffication regime, inflation has remained predictable, averaging 3% from 2016 to 2019. For the month of July this year, the inflation rate of 2.7% stayed below the midpoint of our target range of 2 to 4%, which reflects stable prices for Filipino families. At the end of 2019, we achieved the lowest recorded rates of unemployment at 4.5%, underemployment at 13%, and poverty incidence at 16.7%, compared with a 23.5% in 2016. Of course, these numbers have been severely impacted by the pandemic. And next week, we will be seeing the release of the LFS. Our gross international reserves were at an unprecedented level of close to $98 billion in July, sufficient for 8.9 months worth of imports. Our foreign reserves are more than our outstanding external debt, which stood at $81.4 billion as of March of this year. Our country's hefty foreign currency reserves, as well as the continued international confidence in our strong economic fundamentals, are supporting the Philippine peso, making it one of the best performing currencies, if not the best one in the region amidst the pandemic. Year to date, the Philippine peso has appreciated by 4.5% against the US dollar. In a time where build, and external financing are key elements of economic recovery, this is a positive development. Our investment-grade credit ratings have been affirmed by Fitch, Moody's, and S&P, despite the present economic challenges. The Japan Credit Rating Agency even updated us in June of this year, amidst the pandemic, to A- from BBB+. These credit ratings have allowed us to access financing from our development partners and the commercial markets at lower interest rates and longer repayment periods. With more affordable financing, we expanded government expenditures in the first semester by 27% compared to last year. Without continued and increased public sector spending, especially on infrastructure, public health, and social protection, our economy would have performed much worse. We estimate that the first semester GDP would have shrunk by 2.5 percentage points more than it did, or a total of 11.5% versus the actual estimate of 9%. We have reason to believe, however, that the worst part of this calamitous episode is now behind us. Signs of recovery are emerging. Improvements are seen in the manufacturing sector as the economy gradually reopens. The value of the production index for the month of June showed a slower annual decline of 22.5% compared to the 31.2% decrease in May and 41.2% in April. While the volume of production index in June shrank by 19.3% year on year, the decline was slower compared to May's drop of 28.5% and 38.8% in April. In addition, the overall manufacturing capacity reached 73% in June, up from 72.4% in May and 70.5% in April. The country's total merchandise trade further eased its negative trajectory in June with a slower decline of 19.9% after a steep 35.3% contraction in May and 59.5% in April. This slower decline in the country's trade performance signals the resumption of economic activities. These improvements are reflected in increases in tax collection. Customs was able to surpass its July collection target by 5% due to higher import volumes, indicating some recovery in trade. The Bureau of Internal Revenue exceeded its July collection target by 2%. The major tax gains last month were seen in both excise and value-added taxes, signs that consumer spending is starting to pick up. This is relative, of course, to the ECQ period during the second quarter when things were very, very slow indeed. The government has been focused not just on saving lives from the virus, but saving lives from hunger and other diseases. Congress responded swiftly by enacting the Bayanihan to Heal As One Act in March, 1 week within the declaration of the enhanced community quarantine. This law granted expanded powers to the president for COVID-19 response measures, which included the Small Business Wage Subsidy Program, which provided relief to more than 3 million employees of small businesses, and the 205 billion peso Emergency Subsidy Program, the largest social amelioration program in our country's history for the informal sector. These emergency measures allowed our people to get through the most restrictive lockdowns, which were needed at the time. However, it is time to start rebuilding the economy. Fiscal responsibility guides us as we put together a recovery plan that we can afford and fully execute. Our economic recovery plan includes the passage of 4 legislative imperatives. First, a fiscally responsible Bayanihan to Recover as One Act, or Bayanihan 2, will provide another round of fiscal measures to stimulate consumer demand and support businesses and individuals. Both the Senate and House of Representatives have ratified the bill, which will soon be sent to Malacanang for the President's signature. Second, we are working with the Senate toward the swift passage of CREATE, or the Corporate Recovery and Tax Incentives for Enterprises Act. CREATE will reduce corporate income taxes for the majority of small and medium-sized businesses by 5 percentage points starting July. So we hope that the version that is passed will be retroactive to July. The tax rate will be reduced further by 1 percentage point annually from 2023 to 2027. This is the first ever revenue eroding tax reform package proposed by the Philippine Department of Finance in response to the crisis, and the largest fiscal stimulus program for enterprises in our country's history. 40 billion in 2020 of reduced revenue, and around 600 billion for the succeeding 5 years that the government will no longer collect, leave in the pockets of businesses, and help them pay for their bills and retain workers especially. The larger reduction also brings the country closer to the ASEAN corporate income tax rate average of 22% and will boost cost competitiveness in doing business. A lower corporate income tax rate combined with the country's strong demographic and economic fundamentals will strengthen the Philippines' attractiveness for investment as we move into a new economy under the new normal. CREATE will also modernize our incentives system. On top of a standard menu of more modern incentives, CREATE will allow us to offer tailor-fitted fiscal and non-fiscal incentives to attract investments that will greatly serve the public interest. Third, we are seeking congressional approval of the Government Financial Institutions Unified Initiatives to Distressed Enterprises, or the GUIDE bill, in short, which will allow for the creation of a holding company that will infuse equity with strict conditions, so no bonuses, no lavish purchases, into strategically important companies that are facing insolvency. Fourth, through the Financial Institutions Strategic Transfer or FIST Act, we will seek to allow banks to dispose of non-performing loans and assets through asset management companies similar to special purpose vehicles created in the 2000s in response to the Asian financial crisis. If FIST is passed, banks will not have to incur costs related to the management and administration of non-performing loans. Bank capital will be freed up to expand lending activities. Allow me to provide a few more updates on Bayanihan II. Again, we thank the Senate and the House of Representatives for passing a fiscally responsible Bayanihan II, which provides the President with powers to address the pandemic through budget and procurement flexibility. The bill also authorizes a fiscal stimulus package to strengthen the health sector, provide appropriate cash for work programs, assist affected economic sectors, and infuse capital to government financial institutions or GFIs for them to support productive sectors of the economy, with every peso having a multiplier effect of 8 to 10 times for credit and up to 20 times for guarantees. The ratified version of Bayanihan II satisfies the request of the executive that appropriations should not exceed 140 billion, although the bill retains a 25.5 billion standby fund that can be triggered if additional revenues become available. Bayanihan II provides relief and assistance to Filipino households and businesses through different programs, such as cash subsidies for low-income households and unemployment or involuntary separation assistance for displaced workers, increased credit and guarantee programs for the private sector, especially MSMEs, special risk allowances for healthcare workers, cash assistance to healthcare workers who contract COVID-19 in the line of duty, funds for hiring 50,000 contact tracers, a one-time 60-day grace period for the payment of all existing, current, and outstanding loans falling due on or before December 31, 2020, a minimum 30-day grace period on residential and commercial rents of lessees not permitted to operate during the pandemic, a minimum 30-day grace period for the payment of utility bills due within ECQ or MECQ, condonation of pending payments of interest, penalties, and surcharges for agrarian reform loans with the restructuring of the remaining original principal without interest. Other salient features include the extension of the net operating loss carryover for losses incurred in 2020 and 2021 from 3 to 5 years. So businesses will be able to deduct losses incurred this year and next year from their gross over the 5-year period following the loss. Repeal of the tax on sale, barter, or exchange of shares of stock listed through IPOs, and the suspension of requirements of permits to build telecommunication towers for 3 years. The government is intent on accelerating our investments in infrastructure. The Build, Build, Build program is the cornerstone of our economic recovery, as investments in infrastructure have the highest multiplier effects in the economy. In response to the pandemic, the Build, Build, Build program now includes greater investments in health infrastructure, isolation facilities, and dormitories for our healthcare workers. As we rebuild the economy, we maintain our commitment to bold fiscal and economic reform measures. These include the remaining packages of the Comprehensive Tax Reform Program and other economic bills that will open up the country to more foreign direct investment, such as amendments to the Foreign Investment Act, the Retail Trade Liberalization Act, and the Public Service Act. These reforms intend to boost the country's push to be a more investment-driven economy, providing more opportunities for retail investors like the members of SharePHIL. CREATE will boost after-tax corporate income, leaving more funds for job creation and firm expansion, which will boost shareholder returns. PFITA, or Package 4 of the tax reform program, will reduce friction costs in financial transactions. Investment liberalization laws will allow more foreign equity into the country, expanding the market for Philippine stocks, boosting demand for equities, and potentially increasing market capitalization. With the issuance of the regulations for the REIT law earlier this year, the range of asset types available for shareholders has broadened. We will redouble our efforts to protect our economic gains over the past 3 years and from previous decades. We will prepare our economy for a strong recovery, strengthen our resilience, and solidify our return to the path of inclusive growth. The global economy is going through a long, dark tunnel. I assure you that we intend to be among the first to emerge on the other side. Thank you very much, and good afternoon again.
Thank you very much, ASEC Tony, for sharing with us the initiatives of the government to revive the economy. We look forward to your joining us later during the panel discussions to entertain the questions that we have received so far. We now come to the section of the summit, ladies and gentlemen, where we ask our panelists to make their presentations. I will introduce them all at the same time in the order of their presentation sequence to allow for a smooth flow of proceedings. We will then have a panel discussion among our panelists, including our keynote speaker, to be moderated by veteran journalist and broadcaster, Mr. Davila. Please note that questions will be addressed during the panel discussion. For those on Zoom, please submit your questions via the Q&A button. For our viewers on Facebook and YouTube Live, please submit your questions via the chat box. And make sure you like and subscribe to SharePHIL's Facebook page and YouTube channel to be able to submit your questions. Our first panelist is Dr. Cielito F. Habito, Professor of Economics at the Ateneo de Manila University, where he is also a Senior Fellow and former Director of the Ateneo Center for Economic Research and Development. He is also Chairman of Brain Trust Incorporated and Operation Compassion Philippines. In 1992 to 1998, he served as Secretary of Socioeconomic Planning, heading the National Economic and Development Authority. And in 1998, he was elected Chair of the UN Commission on Sustainable Development in New York. He was Professor and Chair of the Department of Economics of the University of the Philippines, Los Baños. He also worked at the World Bank, Harvard University, Center for Southeast Asian Studies in Kyoto University, and ADB Institute in Tokyo. An ICD Fellow, he served in the boards of various listed companies. He also holds a PhD and an MA in Economics from Harvard University, Master of Economics from the University of New England in Australia, and a Bachelor of Science in Agriculture, major in Agricultural Economics, summa cum laude, from the University of the Philippines. Our second panelist is Mr. Diwa C Gonigundo, former Deputy Governor of the Bangko Sentral ng Pilipinas. Mr. Guinigundo served the BSP for 41 years, handling monetary policy, treasury operations, loans and credit, asset management, currency management, regional operations, and international operations. He was alternate executive director at the IMF in Washington, D.C. in 2001 to 2003. Earlier, he was head of research at the Southeast Asian Central Bank Center in Kuala Lumpur in 1992 to 1994. He pioneered inflation targeting as the BSP's analytical framework for monetary policy and was instrumental in introducing the interest rate corridor system as a tool for monetary management. He also championed the establishment of credit surety funds to enhance the access of MSMEs to bank credit without collateral. He graduated cum laude at the University of the Philippines School of Economics and earned Master of Science in Economics at the London School of Economics as a scholar of the Central Bank of the Philippines. Our third and final panelist is Mr. Romulo L. Neri, a consultant to various private and public entities, including multilateral agencies. He was the president of NCAO of the Social Security System from 2008 to 2010, and chairman of the Commission on Higher Education from 2007 to 2008. He served as Secretary of Socioeconomic Planning and Director General of the National Economic Development Authority from 2002 to 2005 and from 2006 to 2007. He also served as Secretary of the Department of Budget and Management from 2005 to 2006 and became a Monetary Board member of the Bangko Sentral ng Pilipinas from 2005 to 2008. He was a faculty member as well of the University of the Philippines and the Asian Institute of Management. He holds a Bachelor of Science in Business Administration degree from the University of the Philippines, magna cum laude and class valedictorian, and a Master of Business Administration, major in Finance and International Management from the University of California in Los Angeles. Let us now hear from our first panelist, Dr. Habito. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon to everybody. Let me put up my slides. Just want to make sure it is there. I'm having a problem. There you go. Right. I suspect many of you have seen many of the slides I have to share with you today. So I will actually go through a fast clip and try to fit within my 15 minutes allotted. So really the question is, how do we find our way out of the Philippine recession? And what do we want to be arriving at when we find our way out? And I'll just organize my talk into two major questions. Where are we now? Again, a quick rundown on what exactly the state of the economy is, but I will not dwell too much on that because USEC Lambino has already indicated to us what these are. So I guess our better interest is in what lies ahead. Let me get right to where it is. And I think many of you already know of my trademark PITIC test, where we're looking at presyo, trabajo, and kita, prices, jobs, and incomes as the main economic indicators that the ordinary Filipino can relate to. And of course, many of you already know my color coding as well. That good news in my slides come in Ateneo blue, and the bad news comes in the green that torments our basketball team. The good news is, well, one of the bullets, which is inflation, because prices have remained stable. Our inflation rate year to date remains 2.5%. which is the same as it was for the full year last year as an average. The challenge really is in jobs, and we already know the statistic that we had 17.7% unemployment as of the April survey. And I'm eagerly awaiting, by the way, anytime now the July survey figures should be coming out. But again, there's been a lot of unemployment. It's 7.25 million who are now jobless out of our labor force. And the kita part, or income, is again the prominent news about the negative 16.5 second quarter contraction, which translates to a 9% contraction for the first semester. So this chart shows you the roller coaster ride on inflation and how, even though we have had a slight uptick lately, we're still averaging 2.5% on an annual basis. But here's the unemployment numbers, and you can see now the loss of jobs split out by sectors, where services has lost the most and agriculture has lost the least. And that jives with the fact that, as you'll see in a while, that agriculture was the only positive grower in this past quarter. Now, in this slide, I like to point out the quality of the jobs. And here we've lost what we consider the best quality jobs in the economy, which are the wage-paying jobs. Wage and salary workers declined both in number, and that's almost 6.5 million workers from the wage and salary worker category losing their jobs. And the proportion also went down from 65.2 to 63.2%. And in the own account workers, of which there are two categories, the individually self-employed and the self-employed with employees, I like to think of the latter as really a real-time, at least with the labor statistics, a real-time count of our micro, small, and medium enterprises, because that's what they are. These are small self-employed people who have a few employees and therefore operating small businesses. So I think what I'd like to highlight here is that if you look between January this year and April, we had already lost close to 400,000 of these self-employed employees, or we have lost that much of micro, small, and medium enterprises. So this is disconcerting news. But of course, across the board, we already have job losses. And in fact, between January, by the way, and April, the actual total loss was close to 9 million. You see, what you saw in the earlier table was January a year ago, or sorry, April a year ago to April this year. But just between the first and second quarters, it was actually a loss of almost 9 million. If you look at the Kita part, again, we can see here the performance of agriculture, which is positive, the only positive performer among our three sectors this time. And by the way, there usually are the laggards among the three major sectors. But now that we're seeing double-digit declines in industry and services, agriculture actually shines. And luckily, the growth rate is about equal to the population growth rate. So the theoretical share of each Filipino in the total national income has not declined since a year ago. The GDP growth, of course, is a double-digit decline, as we have already said. No? But let's take a closer look at agriculture. There's good news on the overall, well, 1.6%, but there's still too much negatives. No? If you can see the positives here, the ones pointed with blue arrows, I guess standing out is sugarcane, which actually grew by 76%. That's a zooming growth. And their problem right now is they're up to their ears in sugar. And we really have to look for export markets because consumption is down. But the other important thing, of course, is the 7.2% growth in palay and 15.6% growth in corn. And these are, of course, the biggest, along with coconut, among the biggest crop sectors in our agricultural sector. So you can see there that that was enough to bring the agricultural sector to a positive growth. Now, if you look at industry, of which there are four subsectors: mining and quarrying, manufacturing, utilities, construction, it's all negatives, and particularly double-digit negatives, except for utilities, because of course we all still needed our electric power, our water, albeit still a decline in the actual consumption of these particular utility services. Now, in this slide of manufacturing sectors, this is usually in normal times predominantly blue, because positive growth manufacturing industries would dominate. But now it's only pharmaceutical products and refined petroleum, understandably, which have actually continued to have positive growth. And then pharma products, not surprisingly, faster than the usual GDP growth rate we have at 7.7%. But look at the rest of manufacturing down the line. It's all negative. Food manufacturers, although again, that's something we don't expect to be affected much, still had a negative 9% or a decline of 9%. Still, that is the best performance among the negatives in the food and in the manufacturing industries. In services, again, it's green. It's negatives across the board, except for, logically, information and communication. We still had to be in touch, especially with internet. And of course, the banks and insurance companies continuing to grow. So government services had to be growing because that was the only possible way to pump prime the economy that's actually declining. Again, I like to point out how the financial services sector is always in a win-win situation. Whether the economy is up or down, it tends to do quite well. So, some of you have already seen how I pointed out this 15-year period between 2004 and 2019, average GDP growth 5.8, average financial sector growth through that period was 8.9. Let me jump to the third bullet. In the second quarter of this year, we had a negative 16.5 contraction, as we already know. but the financial sector still expanded by 6.8%. And by the way, the measurement of that in the statistics is through the profits of the banking sector. So not surprisingly, of course, the big banks have been disclosing double-digit profit increases since last year. And so that's the reason why, through thick or thin, the banks seem to win. The demand side of the GDP is also useful to examine, because we can tell where the impetus to actually produce has actually declined. And it's actually predominantly household consumer spending, which is almost 70% of the total demand for goods and services in the economy. And that took quite a hit, as we all know, negative 15.5%, which is something we have not seen in recent history. In fact, maybe I would suspect it was only in the World War II that this kind of decline in consumption spending really happened. But then again, you also see investment spending, which is that fixed capital formation, negative 37.8. So that's really total spending in the economy, whether it's foreign, domestic, or whether it's government or private investment. All of that went down. You can see where the hits were, especially in household construction activity, with a negative 75% drop. And the only positive investment component was, again, agricultural investment, reflecting the positive performance of agriculture, where the breeding stock and orchard development grew by 2.2% in the second quarter. So some further indicators, aside from the GDP, inflation, etc. Inflation is still here. Up to July, we have 2.7, as I said. But if you look at volume of manufacturing and industrial power consumption, very closely related, there seems to be at least a tapering off of the decline. In other words, the negatives are less severe compared to what they were in April. In fact, since April, the negative numbers have been getting smaller. And it's also worrying that the OFW remittances, which is a primary propellant of our consumer spending, which, as you remember, I said it's about 70% of the total demand in our economy. The fact that it's declining, and before we were only seeing growth rates declining from double digits to single digits. Now it's negative, meaning it's all dropping. And therefore, what we see here is a peaking of that drop in May. Fortunately, by June, the number showed only a negative 4.2 drop. But again, that is clearly affecting consumer spending in the economy. So if we look at the rest of the economy, well, one of the first things that we ought to be worrying about, I think, is that there's a steep slide in foreign direct investments, which otherwise would be creating jobs in the economy. And this has been happening for 3 years now. And we peaked in 2007 with 10.3 billion US dollars. It dropped by 4.9% in 2008 to 9.9. It dropped by an even deeper decline of 23% in 2019. And guess what? In the first quarter of this year, it's an even steeper decline of 36.2%. And what's sad about this is that most of our neighbors are still having increases in FDI, especially cashing in on the exit of investors from China, especially precipitated by the US-China trade war. We are not apparently catching on to that opportunity. And therefore, here we are, kulelat all over again in terms of attracting FDI, at least among our comparable neighbors. So as I go to what lies ahead, I just ask two questions here. How do we speed up the recovery? And what should our new normal look like? Well, the first question really is, how do we restore jobs as quickly as possible? And the question to ask, which industries and which parts of the country account for the most jobs? Because you'd logically want to focus there. And then as far as restoring incomes or output, the same question, which industries, which areas of the country contribute the most to output and incomes? Well, here they are. The most important contributor of jobs is wholesale and retail trade. Now, that's not just the shopping malls for the retail trade, but also a whole lot of, again, individually self-employed retailers like your fishbowl vendors, your balut vendors, and so on. But altogether, that makes up almost 9 million of our workers, or about more than 20%, or more than 1/5. But next is agriculture, hunting, and forestry, which did post positive growth. And I highlight this because agriculture links directly also with the trade industry because, of course, agricultural products have to be traded. It also links with manufacturing because the biggest segment of manufacturing sector is food manufacturing or food processing. It links directly with transport and storage because the agricultural products have to be transported and stored. And it also links with the tourism and accommodation and food services industries because of the food requirements in these establishments. And if you look at the GDP contributions, manufacturing is the top contributor. And therefore, again, you would want to restart the manufacturing sector, right? But if you look at this list, the things that are near the top are the ones hardest also to open up most completely. Now, agriculture is there, but it's a little down below, except, as I said, I'd like to point out the linkage it has with manufacturing itself, with trade and repair services, with transport, storage, and communication. So that in the end, agriculture, and here fishing has its own category, could actually be an important contributor, not only directly, but also indirectly to the revival of our economic production and therefore generation of incomes. Now, if you look at the spending side again, what is propelling our GDP, the single biggest, as I already said, is household final consumption expenditure being adversely affected by OFW reduction or actually falling remittances. But again, the other spending categories are durable equipment, and which we know dipped by double digits, 33%, if I recall the number earlier. And so that means that we can't really look too much there. But again, the challenge is how do we particularly provoke that very first figure on household final consumption expenditure. In terms of which areas to focus on to recover most quickly, again, logically, you'd look at where the GDP is highest in terms of contribution and where the jobs are also the most concentrated. And that's really NCR, Metro Manila, Region 3 or Central Luzon, and then Region 4A or Calabar Zone. To some extent, of course, in the Visayas, the Cebu region or 7, and in Mindanao, the Davao region or Region 11. Put in a map, it's easier to see and appreciate the dilemma that we have. The areas of the country where the COVID incidents have been heaviest, based on the tracking, is these red areas in the map. But if you look at where the gross domestic product is, or gross regional domestic product, and the population, and therefore the workers, it's the same regions of the country. So the conclusion I get out of this is that the areas that can most contribute to restoring jobs, production, and incomes are also those where it's most risky to ease up. And that points us then to the countryside, the areas outside of these red areas where agriculture is the primary industry of livelihood of the people. Now, how do you proceed with this revival of the economy? Obviously, we have to have a phased reopening. The ones that had to continue even through the pandemic include, again, agri, fishing, and food, and trade, healthcare, banking. The first to possibly reopen would be construction, even though that's troubled also. Among other things, the transport of the workers, the construction site, has also been very difficult. Manufacturing, I'm told that in the economic zones, there have been a recovery of manufacturing activity. And then, of course, mining and BPO can also be reopened, but with the proper physical distancing. The reconfiguration of the rest of the economy will be in the form of scaling up. In the case of the winners, which are online retail, our logistics supporting them, and of course the internet services that support all of these online services, including the ICT and online platforms like Zoom that has become so, in fact, it's Zoom, as you probably heard, Zoom is now more valuable than several airlines combined. Entertainment platforms like Netflix and other artificial intelligence platforms are now the ones hitting it big. But the ones that are really badly hit are restaurants, malls, cinemas, even spectator sports. You know, we're not seeing PBA basketball games these days, obviously. And then what's really happening almost across the board is more automation, more digital technology being applied to our production in manufacturing, including in education, obviously. There's now distance learning that's happening, other services, and including healthcare. Telemedicine has become very, very common now. At the same time, a lot more of work from home. And there are certain industries that can accommodate this to a large extent: finance, utilities, business services, and so on. Now, the question might be, okay, we're talking about stimulus and allotting a lot of money. Of course, there's a debate on the amount. Arise wants 1.3, but Bayanihan 2 has a much more modest amount. But where do we really want to spend it? Because the question is, maybe it's quality, not quantity, we have to be talking about. Because, of course, our executive claims that there are constitutional limits to what can be spent. And you cannot just simply legislate a supplemental budget without identifying revenue sources for the supplemental budget. And by definition, loans are not revenues. So this is really the constraint. So under that situation, we simply have to look at spending the money in a way that will really provide the best the best results. Number one, we want to support essential consumption spending. Why? Because before you even give money to the small enterprises, you have to have the demand for their products and services to go up first. And that means you have to put money in people's pockets. That implies more cash transfers to the poor and the displaced. And of course, even more prior is the testing, tracing, and treatment. We have unfortunately completely mishandled that, and that's why we are now described again as the sick man of Asia. Unfortunately, in additional literal sense, we're also the sickest in terms of COVID. And so it's correct that we need to restore confidence, the confianza that the Vice President was talking about, before we can really enliven the economy all over again. So money has to be spent to do TTT, the three T's right. And then we support the purchasing power of the people. And then now you work on the supply side. And here is where assistance to small business is really important. And unfortunately, some are getting the impression that even more hurdles are being thrown on the way of our small businesses, especially. They are being asked to shoulder the cost of the COVID test, which costs thousands per employee. They're asked to shoulder the cost of additional protocols like face masks and face shields and so on. So, perhaps what we could do with a good part of that stimulus is to provide free and widely accessible COVID tests for employees, especially of small businesses, and even subsidize those incremental costs that they incur for the new safety protocols they have to install. Of course, we also have to look at hard-hit large businesses. The airlines are really suffering and bleeding. Tourism industry in general, like hotels, except those who were able to become the quarantine hotels. No? So really, this is really an extremely difficult task, and I guess we can put our heads together. And that's the question: how do we spend that economic stimulus money to get the most bang for the buck, so to speak? Looking at the outlook, well, the numbers I crossed out here are what our projections were as of February before COVID struck. Now that's all thrown out the garbage because the jobs outlook is now going to be definitely double digit for the full year in terms of unemployment rate, that is. And the GDP growth, we estimate to be anywhere in that range of -6 to -8. And I'll share with you some of the Ateneo macroeconomic model simulations. What we have showing in our model is a little slackening of the decline, but a decline still in the third quarter, 11.8, and then an improvement to -2.8. But the full year would be implied will be -8, and we're looking to a 5.1 next year. Again, this is what our macro model says. I won't go through the rest of the details here, and they're here for us to look at. And I think everybody will get copies of these slides later on. But as I just wind down, let me talk about the new normal. I think we all know what the features of that will inevitably be, including more physical distancing. Face mask usage will probably stay on for quite a while, but there'll be a lot of closures, scaled down capacities in many establishments, especially restaurants, cinemas, more work from home, and then of course, more online retail services. And by the way, because of all of this, perhaps there'll be a dampening of demand for public and private transport, which we can't even restart at this point. No? This will all obviously raise the demand for internet services, e-commerce, ICT products, and the supporting logistics for the e-commerce. So again, those are going to be the winners. But the other thing is banking is changing its nature. It's now going to be a lot more digital. And the banks have to be nimble enough to adjust to that new way of doing business. One welcome development has been more localized value chains, more people even in the cities growing their own food, in fact, and there's more home food production. This is welcome because with shorter value chains, we are now able to assure more stability of supply. You don't have to be consuming vegetables that came all the way from Benguet. Now the people who actually are selling you vegetables via Facebook or via text and they come to you to deliver it are usually coming from growers nearby. And of course, more online learning and distance education. Now that's what would the new normal be like, but what should it be like? Well, I like to think these photographs capture what they are, but let me just say what I mean. More and better equipped hospitals, more testing labs, effective healthcare, effective universal healthcare, more geographically dispersed economic activities, and less focus on Metro Manila, more dispersed urban centers, not even just Manila, Cebu, Davao, but even more, and less concentrated megacities as a result. And because of climate change and sea level rise, a greater shift in the long term towards inland and to higher ground. Now, on the sectoral composition, again, I've already been highlighting agriculture. We have to diversify and modernize agriculture. We need to make it highly productive and competitive, like our neighbors, Thailand and Vietnam, have already demonstrated. Livable cities with a well-organized public transport, and I know MAP has hit the news recently because of our position on how to reorganize our public transport, including hopefully more sustainable modes like bicycle and even pedestrian-friendly transport. Expanded and upgraded internet is a given that we need to have. And again, how well we'll do on that remains up in the air. Effective social protection, social bonding, not social distancing. And I hate that phrase because it really means physical distancing, but we need not be going apart from one another in terms of our social bonds. So anyway, how do we get to this? Well, before I go into that, let me flag one important threat. There may be actually a threat of a worse normal. Why? Because in many cases, people are beginning to say, well, why do you have to look at all these environmental regulations? It's only raised the cost of doing business. And so true enough, President Donald Trump has set aside about 100 or so environmental rules on the reasoning that it will make it harder for business to recover if you still have these regulations. In the country, our own country, what has bothered me tremendously, and I and my friend Bu Chanko have written about it recently, is the way this insertion into the Arise Bill and now even the Bayanihan II Bill of a provision that will tie the hands of the Philippine Competition Commission against acting on mergers and acquisitions that are less than 50 billion. So the limit goes up to 50 billion. And in short, this really gives us the risk of having even more concentrated monopolies and cartels in the post-COVID scenario, rather than have a more inclusive and a more, shall we say, democratic economy. So towards shaping the new normal, let me just quickly run through this. Again, farm diversification and agri-industrialization is something Secretary Dar is indeed already pursuing. Decongest Metro Manila, and one way to do that is try to rechannel the traffic away from the Manila port into the now world standard Batangas and Subic ports. Of course, our internet has to be improved. I like to stress aiming for zero hunger as a national and local policy. I think many of you know how I've been advocating against stunting or severe malnutrition in young children because it's damaging our next generation. On social protection, the national ID is something that is seen to be very important. We need to have investments in hospital modernization, broadening healthcare systems, including these clinics that are more dispersed in the countryside, and then of course our universal healthcare system. Toward greater sustainability, I've already mentioned how we need to plan on moving further inland, but also into our waters, because we're an archipelagic country where the bulk of our wealth is actually in our waters rather than our land. And then they overhaul the public transport system, foster more sustainable lifestyles. But again, my favorite here is more social bonding. And what I mean by that is, in the context of the farms, we can foster more farm and fishery clustering via cooperatives, nucleus estates, block farms, to gain economies of scale for our very fragmented farm structure now. And second, in our neighborhoods, foster strengthened neighborhood and community associations so that we can maintain in close social contact, even if we have to physically distance ourselves for now. So I just want to end with that message about agriculture. Agriculture saved the economy from even worse decline during the second quarter. And so that reinforces my long-held belief that we must really look to agriculture as the economy's ultimate backbone, COVID or no COVID. Maraming salamat po.
Thank you very much, Dr. Habito, for that interesting presentation. We will now proceed to the two other presenters today, but in the interest of time, maybe if I can request our other speakers to keep within their time frame so that we can proceed with the panel discussion. Okay, so next online is Mr. Guinigundo. May I request Mr. Guinigundo to start his presentation?
Okay, thank you very much. And I thank SharePHIL for this great invitation to join this panel on economic recovery. Is there a light at the end of the tunnel? I do realize SharePHIL's request to focus on monetary policy to avoid possible overlap so the panel can cover more grounds, address more issues, and provide more insights on whether we are seeing the light at the end of the tunnel. For me, there is light at the end of the tunnel, but we're still navigating it, the length of which we are quite uncertain, and roadblocks and speed bumps have just become more apparent. Now, I have three propositions this afternoon. One, we entered the tunnel from a position of strength. And I guess ASEC Lambino and Shell actually went through these positions of strength from our many years of gross domestic output performance to better dynamics of inflation, good external payments position, gains in employment, and improvements in poverty alleviation, etc. In short, if we extend our metaphor, our gas tank was quite full. That's my first proposition. The second proposition is that we did not expect that we would pass through a tunnel, but in there, the headwinds are strong. In addition, there were some roadblocks and speed bumps along the way, and it could take us longer. So it's not a question of, is there a light at the end of the tunnel? Yes, there is, but the question is, when do we reach the end of the tunnel? And third, unless we run smarter and hurdle those roadblocks and speed bumps, it is possible we could run on empty tank. To me, this is the big challenge. Okay? So the next slides, slides 2 to 7, I think are very familiar to us. In fact, we saw some of this in the presentation of both Tony and Shell. So basically, what we're saying in these slides 2 to 7 is that the tank is quite full. Number one, our macroeconomic fundamentals were strong and resilient. And this is shown by this chart. And we have this chart on CPI. It continues to lie within the target of 2 to 4%, still benign. And then I think we have seen as well the domestic banking system, which continues to be sound based on the quality of assets and their level of capitalization, which is very important at this time of the pandemic. Now, this chart, of course, shows that the external payments position continues to provide some buffers against global headwinds. In fact, at some points, we showed surplus position in both the current account and the overall balance of payments. Now, this chart was also shown by Tony, just to say that our reserves hit a high of 98 billion. That's about 9 months of imports of goods and services. And I think the BSP expects this to hit $100 billion by the end of the year. And on the other hand, we have the numbers on external debt at about 81 billion, but relative to GDP, it's still close to about 21%. So still okay. Next, we see that we have good ingredients to sustain growth. In other words, to me, I would call this the additives. Okay? The economy has become more efficient. Our total factor productivity has been increasing, and one of the highest in the region, in fact. And we can also see that our demographic factors of young, educated, and a labor force has allowed us to avoid the problems of an aging population, particularly the provision of pension system and other support system in favor of the elderly. Now, this chart shows some of the recent legislation and initiatives by government in promoting quality education and, of course, better health. I think these are the underpinnings of saying that the demographic factors could be translated into demographic dividends moving forward. Now, the next chart shows the underpinnings of nearly 30 years of sustained policy and structural reforms, which have made our economy more market-based, more competitive, even as challenges remain in various areas of the economy. From 1993 up to the present, we continue to see various initiatives in promoting competitiveness of the economy, more market-based system, etc. Now, this chart will show that we have both long-term and medium-term economic strategies. In other words, we have the Ambition 2040 guiding our policies to achieve a more progressive, peaceful, and prosperous society. And against the twin challenges of fighting the pandemic and promoting economic recovery, we have the four-pillar strategy supported by the Bayanihan laws. In short, we have a roadmap, even if quite general. Now, in this slide, we're saying that we are suggesting that indeed we faced this crisis from a position of strength. Our gas tank was quite full. Now, the problem, of course, is as this chart will show, we had to go through a tunnel when the pandemic started to go wild. What made it worse is that because lives were endangered, the government was forced to go into various levels of community lockdowns. And as a result, even business activities were also locked down. And I think Shell covered that very well. Now, it has become a delicate exercise in balancing between health and jobs. Okay? Now, we realized one glaring handicap. Our public health management was very weak. And I would consider this challenge as a headwind, resisting our advance and adding more time for us to negotiate the whole length of the tunnel. Now, a few words on this headwind. In 2019, and this chart will show that, based on the Global Health Security Index, involving 195 countries, the Philippines scored 47.6% out of 100%, covering prevention of the emergence of pathogens, early detection, rapid response, and mitigation of the pandemic, sufficiency and robustness of health system to treat the sick, commitment to improve national capacity and financing, and of course, overall environment and country vulnerability to biological threats. How did we fare in this international comparison? The Philippines was 53rd in the ranking but we are the lowest among the ASEAN 6. Thailand was 6th, Malaysia 18th, Singapore 24th, Indonesia 30th, and Vietnam 50th. The reason is simple. We did not prioritize our health system all these years. The budget has always been too small compared to the huge needs of our people. We are now reaping the wages of our own neglect. Now, to avoid our health system from being overwhelmed, we had to impose lockdowns, and we also locked down business activities in the process. Jobs were lost, incomes were also lost. Now, in addition, the following slides will show there are roadblocks and speed bumps along the way. First is the late, unclear health plan and execution. Testing and tracing came late in the day. The calibration of community quarantine from one type to the other is based neither on science nor evidence. Social protection was less than complete because the distribution was far from complete, and the amounts received were less than the committed amount. Prosecution of quarantine violators was also uneven. With execution problems, we are taking time to test and trace, and in the process, we are lengthening our journey to the end of the tunnel. Second, we have problems in governance. Beyond the disconnect in public policies on health, social protection, and quarantine, as if they are not enough, we heard issues of corruption, especially in the Health Insurance Agency, which is supposed to play a crucial role in assisting our people, especially during this pandemic. We cannot anchor our health policy of survival on a vaccine that may never come in the next 6 to 12 months. If governance is problematic, it is very difficult to inspire confidence among consumers to spend and businessmen to invest and produce, because we are not exactly flattening our own epidemiological curve. And third, there's a lot of uncertainty given all these issues of health capacity, plan, and execution, and governance. The move to form a revolutionary government is not helping any. This raises the issue of rule of law in the Philippines, which in the trading economics ranking of, I think, 180 countries, we were number 113. All the other ASEAN 5 were higher. Singapore was number 4, Malaysia number 51, Indonesia number 85, and Vietnam at 96, and Thailand number 101. Uncertainty discourages economic activities and in turn, economic growth, employment, and of course, income. These 3 factors are our speed bumps and roadblocks. They retard our smooth journey and slows us down. Maneuvering through many roadblocks further slows us down. It also reduces our fuel efficiency, and in the process, we also waste gas. Now, this is where the president is coming from when he declared time and again that we have no more money. Wala ng pera. Because of our failure to arrest the virus, we had to stretch the period of the lockdown and multiply the resources necessary to extend financial support to the poor and the elderly, the unemployed, and of course, the small business. How then should we run smarter and hurdle those roadblocks and speed bumps so we avoid running on empty tank and reach the end of the tunnel and see the light? Well, I agree on the general approach of the government against the twin problems of fighting COVID-19 and promoting economic revival. But in the interest of time, I will now focus on what monetary policy has done and what else it can do to help in economic recovery. The BSP has done more than its fair share of heavy lifting. Now, during a crisis, domestic liquidity and credit are expected to tighten and impinge on sustained economic growth. Now, this crisis, like what the IMF Managing Director Kristalina Georgieva observed, is like no other. It's a global pandemic and no one was spared. Economic activities could not be sustained because everyone could catch the virus. It's plain and simple crisis of confidence. Now, for monetary policy, it will have to be extremely accommodative, not only to ease the release of money based on what the markets require, but also an additional amount to also convince market players that there would always be enough. This was what the BSP precisely did. Policy rates were brought down from 3.5% at the beginning of the year to 2.25% after more than 100 basis points reduction. This is very loose, considering that the expected inflation this year is 2.6% and 3% next year. In effect, we have a negative real policy rate. This is to help reduce the cost of money and induce higher borrowings from banks and encourage more investment and, of course, production. Now, money supply has also been released in a big way. 300 billion in direct purchases of government securities and enormous purchases from the secondary market. The chart we see on the screen further tells us about the different aspects of the easy monetary policy of the BSP during these pandemic times. BSP provides forward guidance, or what they call open mouth operation. Our rules were also tweaked to allow easy compliance with the required reserves. Beyond monetary policy, the BSP has also done heavy lifting in terms of regulatory relief for the banks. 4 planks of central bank supervisory policies were put in place. And here we outline them in terms of extension of financial relief to borrowers, incentivized lending, promotion of continued access to financial services, and of course, support for continued financial services in terms of more digitalization. Now, what else can the BSP do to help usher in economic revival? Now, my view is that it has done enough. At this point, it should continue to monitor the developments. Monetary policy cannot push on a stream, even if the BSP brings down its policy rate to 0 and pumps in more liquidity in the system. It can only do so much to encourage more bank lending. There are limits to excessive monetary easing. Ultra low interest rate and ultra excessive domestic liquidity may be a recipe for future asset bubble in the economy. Money can move from banks to equities and real estate until a bubble is formed and it bursts. We should be very watchful of this possibility. Not this year, maybe not next year, but in the next years to come. Because remember that monetary policy works with a long and variable lag. Now, third point that I want to leave with you is that debt monetization may be justified during this critical pandemic period, but this can never be a permanent fixture of public policy. The law has built-in safeguards, although it looks like the BSP Charter was amended to increase the space for BSP lending to the national government. 2 things must be done immediately, and I believe the government is focused on this, hopefully single-mindedly. 1, the health sector should shape up and strengthen its capacity for testing, tracing, and quarantining, and of course, treating COVID-19 patients. The curve should flatten. Second, fiscal support should be intensified. I think Shell discussed that at length. And of course, Tony. Borrowings can never be relied upon indefinitely. The key is to raise public revenues, but these are hard to come by given the pandemic and economic crisis. There's got to be a big realignment in the budget in favor of health, education, and public works. Pork cannot be tolerated this time. lump sum allocations should be examined carefully to avoid unnecessary spending. These two challenges gain more urgency in the light of the deep recession being projected by the IMF, the World Bank, and the ADB. They think that the Philippines will decline by 3.6 from the perspective of the IMF, 1.9 World Bank, and ADB at 3.8%. Now, on top of that, the market is also looking at some grim assessments, and these were released by some bank analysts precisely on these challenges, on the possible outcome like higher unemployment and, of course, pandemic uncertainty. How will the Philippines be able to address the challenge of flattening the epidemiological curve? But there are rays of hope. Okay? The market is still confident about the long-term prospects of the Philippine economy, as shown by relatively good debt spreads and CDS spreads. Here, we show the debt spreads between end June 162 and 130 for the Philippines. In fact, we have a tighter spread compared to Indonesia and Malaysia, and of course Vietnam. In other words, they're still looking at a good long-term prospects of the Philippines. And this is also shown by the CDS spread. CDS is simply credit default swap. Okay? They could be game changers. Okay? The debt spreads and the CDS spreads could be game changers, but they could easily dissipate if we continue to commit blunder in our fight against the pandemic and missteps in governance. It is important that our people are convinced that our authorities are on top of the situation, addressing what should be addressed, avoiding unnecessary and untimely battles, that governance and policy uncertainty would not complicate the execution, will definitely help restore public confidence. Confidence is the rarest commodity nowadays. It is important that we regain it. So, if we are able to consider these points and address them in action, we may have the chance of making it to the end of the tunnel and see the light of day before we run out of fuel. But it would be tragic if we had to push through the end of the tunnel in utter darkness and frustration. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Governor Guinigundo. We now proceed to the last presenter, Mr. Neri. Mr. Neri, I'm sorry, but can we request that we keep within the schedule because we're a bit running out? Okay, thank you.
Okay.
Thank you very much to allow for time for Q&A.
Thank you. Okay, can we show the presentation, please? Can we project the presentation? The presentation, can we project?
Please go ahead. Please go ahead.
Can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Can you please project the presentation, Anna? Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes,
Yes,
Mr.
we
Neri,
can.
we can hear you. We can hear you. Please go
Can we
ahead.
start? Thank you. Next slide, please. Can we show the next slide? Okay, I was asked to the previous one. Okay, unlike the previous global crisis, all the three shocks are present at the same time. Supply shock, because people can't go to work, demand is collapsing, and the financial markets face bankruptcies. Next slide. Next, please. This is more complex to analyze, much more damaging in its effects, and more difficult to resolve. As the former Finance Secretary Purisima said, is a much, sorry, in unconventional times like these, conventional monetary and fiscal levers are painfully inadequate. Next slide, please. Next. Our basic advocacies: ensure food supply and support basic consumption. We do not let our people go hungry. Empower our people and enterprises to cope with this crisis and strengthen their resilience and remove any obstacles to this resilience. We have to improve the national balance sheet through productivity and equity enhancing investments. And we will need paradigm shifts for a more pro-people and pro-nature economic development. If I may quote the IMF, next slide. Next slide, please. This recovery is to be sustainable, and if our world is to become more resilient, we must do everything in our power to promote a green recovery. The previous one, please. According to Philip Kotler, citizens need to re-examine our capitalist assumptions and emerge from this terrible period with a new and more equitable form of capitalism. McKinsey said that ameliorating poverty, diminishing inequality, and protecting the environment could figure prominently in global and national agendas. In other words, things will not be the same. We cannot do things as usual. Next, please. The role of government. The role of government, next slide. Next slide, please. Support household consumption through income transfers. Demobilize unemployed through productivity enhancing investments. Add new economic values to compensate for GDP losses. Regenerate the natural resources to sustain food security and strengthen our people's capacity to cope with this crisis. Can we go to the next slide, please? Next. 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 It's covered already. Next, please. Next. In fisheries, I would just like to emphasize the need to replant mangroves and restore our coral reefs and do fish sanctuaries so our fish can prosper, our fish catch can prosper. To facilitate markets, we will need internet and e-commerce access for farmers and rural entrepreneurs, and school nutrition and LGU purchases as a steady market for farmers' produce. Next, please. The role of the private sector. The role of the private sector. Next slide. Large corporations can engage as small farmers through inclusive business, and corporate agriculture nucleus estate can be made with small farmer linkages, and we can have private malls feature processed agriculture from the provinces. A strong and vigorous agriculture will ensure our people's survival and serve as a platform for economic recovery. Next slide. Let us go to telecommunications. Can we go to the slide on telecommunications? Next, please. Telecommunications. This is important because telecommunications, can we go back to telecommunications, is key to our people's ability to survive this crisis. We suggest that Congress pass as soon as possible the Open Access Data Transmission Act so we can have more players in the broadband space and reduce the cost. Efficient telecommunications is key to our people's ability to cope with this crisis, and internet should be seen as a basic human right. Next, please. Government. Let's go to government. Government. Okay. As Cesar Purisima said, government should be an anchor of stability, and government must be clear and coherent. Next, please. Next slide. We will have to redesign government so it can better respond. Go back to government, please. Government. We may need to redesign government so it can better respond to the current and post-pandemic scenario. LGUs will have to play a key role to speedily respond to our people's needs in a dynamic environment. countryside LGUs can activate their extension programs in the DA, and we may have to mobilize the military personnel for reforestation and upland development. Next, please. Imports. Imports. We will have to reduce our dependence on rice imports by diversifying our food staple. We expect droughts to happen in Burma, Vietnam, and Thailand because China is damming up the rivers, the upstream rivers of the Mekong Delta and the other areas in Indochina. Next, please. Next. Next slide, please. Okay, this is important. We can infuse money to the rural areas to activate the economy there. We can pay the upland farmers to do terracing to prevent soil erosion, plant hedge crops, forage trees, and fruit trees. They can construct gabion dams and water catchment projects for upland development. We can also pay the fisher folks to plant, restore the coral reefs, and protect their fish sanctuaries and patrol their fishing grounds. Next slide. Next, please. A productive countryside will reduce rural migration to the cities, and urban poor can find livelihood in the countryside. Financing sources. We can target a 2 trillion financing for these measures. So an economic recovery bond to shore up the fiscal resources for income transfers. So an economic reconstruction bond for countryside development. And I've already enumerated there the other usual sources for financing. Next, please. Foreign direct equity investments. Okay, we will need to remove the disincentives of foreign equity investments. We will have to lift the foreign ownership restrictions, amend the Public Services Act, reduce our labor rigidities, and possibly have labor-intensive zones exempt from minimum wages. And we will have to pass the apprenticeship law. And LGUs will have to cooperate instead of hinder foreign investments. We now go to financial resources for government from property rights. Next slide. We can expand our agricultural areas through upland development. That's about 15 million hectares we can develop and convert them to E&D once they are developed and planted as prescribed. We can also pass the Sustainable Forest Management Act and revise agrarian reform law to feed the rural land market for agribusiness and fast-track land titles for agricultural properties and farm-to-market roads to add to countryside property values. Higher property values in the countryside and the creation of these new property values can be a source of finance for the government. We now go to our paradigm shifts. Next slide. Okay. Pope Francis has said that unbridled consumerism is destroying our planet. So we need paradigm shifts in our mode of development, from unbridled consumerism to an environmentally nurturing economics, from private spending for private wealth or public spending for common entitlements, from shopping malls to public parks, from malnourished children to universal school feeding. Next. From denuded mountains to agroforests and water catchments, from flooded lowlands to preserved wetlands and clean rivers, from barren seas and bays to a thriving marine life. Next. From low-income urban services to upland and coastal projects, from military fighting the NPA, we can have the AFP be mobilized for upland development. And we can have drug addicts plant forests and mangroves so they can be more useful. Next. Next slide, please. From urban jungle and polluted air to green buildings. Go back and we go back. From urban jungle and polluted air to green buildings and rooftop gardens and walkable roads. From congested Metro Manila, we can transfer the national capital to another area like the Lucena Pagbilao area. Baguio has become rather overdeveloped, and we may need to have a new development for uplands like Mount Irid and replant it with pine trees. Mount Irid is in the Rizal province, and if we can build a road there, we can be in Mount Irid in less than an hour. Next, please. I will just do my concluding statements by quoting my favorite authors. This pandemic could give rise to a new era of human development. Otherwise, economic and social development may fall for decades. That's from McKinsey. Succeeding generations will live in a profoundly altered world. Practicing radical economic compassion and addressing inequalities, not just in our post-recession recovery, but here and now. Social unrest and collapse await as the alternative. We go to the last slide, please. From McKinsey. A study by the Edelman Trust Barometer found that more than half of its respondents in 28 markets agreed that capitalism as it exists today does more harm than good in the world. Almost 3/4 said that CEOs should take the lead in change rather than waiting for government. Pressure on business to serve their communities will only build. Business must step up. And finally, imagination, leadership, and a dash of inspiration will be required to figure out the right policies for the 21st century. This is from the McKinsey article, 10 Lessons from History for the Next Normal. That ends my presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Neri. Now that we have completed the presentations, we will now move to our panel discussion to be moderated by Ms. Karen Davila. Karen? I think you're on mute, Karen. Yeah, okay.
All right.
Thank you. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. Jimmy, first of all, I'd like to welcome everybody to the forum. And I'd like to say, I'll apologize ahead of time. I was asked to moderate this panel discussion from 3:20 p.m. to 3:55 p.m. And I have a newscast on ANC at 4 o'clock. So I am going to go on the air in a few minutes. But let me ask first the first question, and I'll have Jimmy take over, and then I'll get back to the forum. So I'm in two computers right now as we speak. I've noticed I was able to listen to all the presentations, and all our speakers essentially covered a short-term, medium-term, and long-term approach to the problem of the country. Of course, the long-term approach is much harder to discuss given that we have time constraints. But let's start first with the short-term approach. I'll start with ASEC Tony Lambino, and you can start, and then Professor Habito, everybody can chime in. The criticism of many observers is this, frankly. Bayanihan 2 is very small. We're talking about 140 billion pesos, frankly, and it's loose change from really what the country needs. We have asked why the DOF is insisting on this measly amount compared to, let's say, the Arise bill that Congresswoman Stella Kimbo has proposed of 1.3 trillion divided into 3 years, which amounts to 400 billion a year, or the version of Senator Ralph Recto, which would amount to 1 trillion. The DOF insists to keep the national debt below 50% of the size of the economy. The DOF refuses to borrow more money. You've also turned down the proposal of Senator Amy Marcos for a debt moratorium. Other Southeast Asian countries are borrowing more money. More banks want to lend money. We do know that the MSMEs are suffering. Private banks don't really want to lend to small business. And that's the truth of the matter. So the Bayanihan 2 sounds good, but it sounds good on paper. So at the end of the day, ASEC we're looking at 3 to 4 months of no growth And really, the question is, what kind of help will this give? So please go ahead, take the floor, sir.
Thank you, Karen, and appreciate the thoughts and the questions. We've come across these queries quite a bit, no? So they are in the minds of our countrymen. The most important thing about the limit is that it is something that we can deliver. The 140 billion already took into account looking for sources of funds that could be put together and that could actually be delivered. That is critical because if not, then it's an unfunded mandate. There's going to be so much in the bill or in the law once it's signed, and the government will not be able to execute all the programs in the law. And you will hear so many sectors saying, but it's in the law, you have to fund it, and yet we don't have the money for it. So again, the fiscal responsibility is second. First is, can we actually deliver? The second is the fiscal responsibility. And as Karen mentioned, there are so many who say we should borrow more, etc. Borrowing is okay to use for the deficit, which means whatever we are not able to raise in terms of resources from taxes and the like and other revenues, given the 2020 national budget, the budget that Congress actually approved last year or early this year. Without that authorization, you cannot just borrow to cover supplemental appropriations. Our legal team has weighed in, and they said that the Constitution does not allow that. So the supplemental appropriations require new or additional revenue. And we just don't have that given the situation that we're in. We can't borrow our way out of that hole, in other words. But we can borrow against what Congress has authorized and what our deficit is, given the reduction in the collections that we're already experiencing. But as I mentioned earlier, there is an increase in the collections in the second half of the year, relative to the severe lockdowns in the second quarter. Now, the other thing I would like to share is that 140 billion is made up of several components. Some of it are emergency measures, cash subsidies, support to our health system, but around 30 to 40 billion of the 140 is to our government financial institutions. And with the combination of reforms that we have proposed, and as I mentioned, the guide and the FIST bill, the guide will allow GFIs to form a holding company that can make a equity infusion in companies that are nationally or strategically important but are facing insolvency. And the FIST bill is the SPV revival bill, essentially, so that banks can offload the NPLs and the non-performing assets that are going to start catching up with us over the next few months. And we already know that when we completely expect that. But in combination with the 30 to 40 billion that's going to our government financial institutions, that 30 to 40 billion has a multiplier effect of around 8 to 10 times if it's credit, or even up to 20 times if it's credit guarantee, to fill guarantee. So it's not just 140 billion. Actually, the economic team was very insistent that those appropriations be made to the GFIs so that there are multiplier effects. And again, in combination with the other reforms. We should not see Bayanihan 2 as a standalone. It's with the Arise, with the Arise Inc., which is in the guide bill, which is different from the Arise bill, which was filed in the House. And I can explain the difference more later if there's interest. The FIST bill, and actually something that Dr. Habito talked about earlier, agriculture. Now, there is also another bill that is being strongly supported. Now, again, the BSP is in the forefront of that one, like the guide and the fist, which is amendments to the Agri-Agra law. Amendments that will allow banks to comply finally with the law, and secondly, lend to the whole value chain, the whole agricultural value chain, not just to the beneficiaries of land reform and the like. So those are, again, it's a set of reforms that have been proposed. Each one should not be seen in isolation, but they should be seen in combination. Thank you.
Thank you, Asik Lambino. So just taking over a little bit from Karen. So it's, what are there any provisions or what are the safeguards that the government is looking at in terms of making sure that all of those incentives provided for under the Bayanihan II Act are actually spent the right way? No? Are there any provisions in the proposed bill that the president intends to veto? Or if yes, what are these and why?
Well, I'll answer the last part first. I don't think there's any consensus that it's an appropriations measure. Now, if it were an appropriations measure, then the line item veto could be exercised. But I understand that the Senate made it clear in the records, when they actually ratified this, that they see it as an emergency bill. So that's one thing. So it's not clear at all whether a line item veto can be exercised by any. Second, in terms of safeguards, a number of them were put in place. For instance, the biggest one that we worked with our legislators on is so that national government agencies that are really not good at being lenders not have their own loan programs. Because in the beginning, when we looked at the drafts, there were so many proposals to have DOTR provide loans, DA provide loans, etc., the Department of Tourism, etc. We consolidated all of that under the GFIs. But what the national government agencies can do with the resources that have been provided to them is to provide interest rate subsidies for their stakeholders. So for instance, tourism stakeholders can borrow money from a land bank or DBP, and then the Department of Tourism can actually provide an interest rate subsidy for those borrowers so that they're facing lower interest rates. So those are some of the key features that were worked on very, very closely with our legislators. And of course, there's the reporting requirements, not to Congress. The regular reporting will occur as it did in Bayanihan I, so that Congress can exercise oversight over the implementation of Bayanihan.
Okay, so there were slides earlier that showed that the amount of foreign direct investments in the Philippines have really declined substantially, and this next wave of migration from China to the rest of Asia, the Philippines is not catching any of that. So is there any particular move by the government to address or to attract more FDIs as part of the recovery plan? Is that covered by any of those proposed bills?
Yes, Jimmy, definitely. The CREATE bill, which is the package 2 of the tax reform program, not only lowers the corporate income tax rate from 30 to 25%, closing in on the regional average immediately. And we want this to be retroactive to July, if at all possible. The incentives that we provide have been historically limited to fiscal incentives. But other countries, Singapore, Thailand, Vietnam, are not constrained by this. So one of the key revisions of the bill from CITIRA to CREATE is to allow the Fiscal Incentives Review Board to recommend to the president with conditions. For instance, the conditions are the project has to have a comprehensive sustainable development plan with inclusive business approaches, a minimum investment capital of $1 billion, or minimum direct local employment generation of 10,000 within 3 years, etc. No? So there are certain conditions that have to be met in order for the Fiscal Incentives Review Board to recommend to the president a set of fiscal and non-fiscal incentives. So for instance, training support or support in finding the right real estate requirement that an investor has, or for instance, facilitation of permitting and licensing. So those kinds of things that investors on a case-by-case basis might really require in order to make the Philippines more attractive than other options. So yes, the CREATE bill lowers the corporate income tax rate. That's attractive for those who want to access our market, which we know once the pandemic is addressed through the vaccine, will become a very, very attractive consumer market again for investors. Secondly, the ability to provide super incentives for super investments that will benefit the public interest, subject to conditions. Third, there is, I guess, if we step back from CREATE, there is the sense that has been shared by members of the American Chamber of Commerce, the Japanese Chamber, etc., that actually a lot of investors are waiting for CREATE to be passed. There's this wait and see attitude that investors have taken because the legislation has taken so long. It's not just a 2-year wait, and the president has actually mentioned package 2 4 times already, in his sonas. But actually, this is a reform that is 2 decades more or less in the advocacy already, across different administrations. In fact, we have our former finance secretaries on record saying that the time is now to pass this because it's been attempted so many times. So the other thing I'd like to share is for those who argue that it's the fiscal incentives that really matter. If you look at the numbers of BOI, Board of Investments, versus PEZA, PEZA's numbers have been declining severely. BOI's numbers actually have been holding up and actually have been going up if you look at the pre-pandemic numbers. That's because BOI allows for investments that don't necessarily just rely on forever GIE incentive. They allow for a wider set of incentives and a wider set of options of where to invest. So again, it's not, and I don't share that to just make the comparison for the heck of it. I'm sharing that because if you look at the BOI pledges, the numbers really have been holding quite well without, of course, the pandemic, the pandemic period. If you look before. So yes, the CREATE bill is a big initiative in the area of investment promotion.
Thank you very much, Sec. Tony. Now, this question is now addressed to Mr. Dr. Shell Habito. You were proposing in your presentation that geographic dispersal should not be supported by, is one of the answers to actually the recovery program. So, and should this not be supported by good infrastructure? And shouldn't this be the direction of the Build, Bid program of the government to support economic dispersal or geographic dispersal?
Well, yes, indeed. And of course, what this means, perhaps we have to revisit the lineup of projects in the Build program itself. There's a lot of scope for further improving the composition, the whole package of projects, so that it will truly support more dispersal of economic activity outside of Metro Manila and Regions 3 and 4A. So that kind of exercise has to be done. But obviously, at this point, some of the budgets allotted for build projects will really have to be reallocated to more urgent concerns, especially creating demand. And again, hopefully in a way that will maximize the multiplier process from these amounts that are being allotted by government. And just to allude a little bit to the earlier question, in slightly in defense of the executive here, there is such a thing as a multiplier effect on the spending as well. I mean, Governor Guinigundo was talking earlier about the multiplier effect on the GFI side. This is the monetary multiplier. But on the other hand, in terms of spending multipliers, if we spend that money correctly so that it will go into high multiplier effect expenditures, and of course, one of those is precisely just put it in the hands of consumers who will spend it immediately, and therefore it will go through the round and round in the economy. But the other thing is you avoid spending that money on too much of imported materials, especially in the combating COVID. And one thing that pains me is this complaint by our local garment manufacturers who actually refocused into producing PPEs. And then the Department of Health goes into saying that, no, they're not good enough. We still have to import them. And so rather than help that multiplier effect in our local garments industry by procuring, of course, help them by all means, no, to meet the standards, we are actually leading to a expenditure pattern that will actually lower that multiplier effect. So the thing is, indeed, a few hundred billion can actually turn into the 1.3 or more trillion simply from the expenditure multiplier effect in the economy. So it's a matter of quality of the spending rather than quantity.
To follow up to that, Dr. Habito, I think one of the things that you also mentioned is the fact that we need to give more money to the people who need to spend it. And well, we've seen different programs already implemented by the government to achieve that. But do you think there are improvements that need to be made to ensure that the money gets to where it should be and that people are really incentivized to spend?
Well, I don't know where we are on the national ID system. I guess that's on the shoulders of Secretary Carl Chua now. But indeed, that would be the way to have a more efficient way to have a more focused targeting of this ayuda or this assistance precisely directly to put purchasing power in the hands of consumers. And clearly, there were a lot of complaints or observations that some of those who were deserving didn't get it. Some of those who got it got duplicative allotments and all that. So clearly there's a lot of improvement, the scope for improvement in the way that we are distributing the ayuda. And hopefully we can fix that. But the conclusion is clear. We need more of that because right now the jobs are still not back, and they need to have that as a matter of survival.
Okay, thank you. I saw Karen earlier. Karen, are you there? I saw Karen earlier. Karen, are you there? I think you're on silent.
Yeah.
Karen, I think you're on silent. Okay, but maybe we can address while waiting for Karen to be online. Maybe from the other panelists, Mr. Neri or Mr. Diwa, Mr. Guinigundo, are there any other areas that you think the government should focus on in terms of crafting or implementing the economic recovery program?
Well, let me weigh in on the issue of the fiscal stimulus. And I'd like to support both Tony and Shell on this.
Hello.
It's just a question of amount of fiscal incentive or stimulus, but I think it will all depend on the quality. First of all, I think it's important that there should be a reallocation in the budget. We are more than halfway of the year, and therefore some of the build projects can no longer be executed for the rest of the year, especially that the rainy season has come. So I think there is a scope, there is some flexibility for reallocating some of the budget. And whatever can be squeezed from that reallocation can always be reallocated in favor of social spending or the ayuda, support of small business, and of course the rest of the vulnerable areas. I think it's important that that is done. I was earlier saying that pork cannot be tolerated this time. I think it's important that those lump sum allocations be examined carefully to avoid unnecessary spending. I think in the process we would be able to squeeze more pesos from whatever is left of the budget. Now, second, it is not only through fiscal incentives or fiscal stimulus that we can help stimulate the economy. I think the BSP has already brought down the policy rate to a level that can promote more lending by the banks. In fact, the banks have more than 700 billion, 800 billion because of the reduction in the reserve requirement. And the BSP did not pay a single centavo on that deposit. So now that they were able to get it back, they can easily lend it to their depositors and their clients, and that can help stimulate economic activity in the process. There was also a lot of regulatory relief that the central bank has done so far. So I think it's a question of getting all of this together and coming up with a more stimulative package, both fiscal and monetary. I think that's something that we should look at. Thank you.
Mhm. I'm back. I don't know if can you guys see me?
Yes, Karen, we can.
Yes. And I
Thank you.
wanted to react to Mr. Guinigundo, what he said. Just recently, Governor Ben Diokno wanted to put a cap essentially on credit, on interest rates. As he said, you've made a strong point on the heavy lifting already done by the BSP. And Governor Ben Diokno just a few days ago cited that credit cards, for example, don't have a credit limit. If you calculate it, it goes beyond, if it's 3.5, 3.6 a month, it would go to something almost 40% a year, right? And Governor Diokno made a strong point that he wanted to put a cap of, I can't remember the exact figure, but he said something, am I right, sir? Something like 20+%?
Half of what is being charged by the banks. I think it's something like 24%.
Yes, and that would be quite interesting because if that did happen, you'd have many more people using, frankly, their credit cards. And what would it take to do that? Because I have a few credit cards. I have not seen any of the private banks, frankly, act on that.
I think it's important that well, I'm out of the BSP now, but I think it's important for the Bangko Sentral to do this by moral suasion.
Okay.
Moral suasion from the mouth of the regulators, I think, is even stronger than a circular or a memo circular, especially at this point when people are hard up, when people have lost their jobs and their businesses. I think it's important that the central bank takes a very strong position on this. We're not saying that we should be administering interest rates because we are a market-based economy. But I think at this point, when it's an abnormal time, and therefore some abnormal policies or initiatives by the regulator should also be considered. So I think the central bank can take a look at it on a basis of something that is time-bound. Okay. Now, when let's say 1 year or 2 years would be over, I think we should be back to where we started, where it should be open to market-driven forces, the determination of the interest rate charged there.
Okay. So just to continue from that thought, what you just said is number one, to consider it. One is moral suasion, to perhaps consider something that's time-bound. I've heard some businessmen tell me that there's a lack of imagination sometimes with how ideas are brought out in government. And one of them, they said, is the reason ASEC Tony and Professor Shell, Professor Romulo, the reason why the 55 billion pesos for MSMEs was put in Bayanihan too was because private banks weren't doing their part. There's a lot of liquidity in private banks, But frankly, they didn't want to lend to MSMEs. That's why the government had to put the 55 billion in Bayanihan 2, and it's going to DBP, to Land Bank, wherein the interest rates are very high. So this, what role should private banks really make in, frankly, reviving the economy again?
You know, in the past, the central bank and the banks have this so-called gentleman's agreement on certain issues. I think this is something that can be explored again by Governor Jokno and the members of the Monetary Board. You know, they can meet in private, they can discuss what is happening today. And it is very important that the banks take on social responsibility more seriously. I think Dr. Habito was saying earlier, no matter what the business cycle is, the banks continue to be profitable. So I think this is something that they can leverage on. In fact, if you take a look at the last statements, financial statements of the banks, while there was some decline in the rate of profit, it's still a positive number. Okay.
Yes.
So this is something that they should try to look at, and without having to disappoint their stockholders, I think they can do their share.
Yes. I'd like to direct this to Professor Romulo Neri and also to Professor Shell. There was a bright light we had was in agriculture. And yet we know that the Philippines, I mean, even in the past several administrations back, we often say agri is important. And yet, for some reason, we just don't seem to innovate enough, modernize. There's just something in the Philippine setting that we don't pour in enough with agri. Okay? 17 billion was put in Bayanihan 2 for plant. Right, ASEC? That's the term. Plant. And perhaps in the 2021 budget, with a realignment, it may increase by just 10 to 15%. As Senator Sonny Angara said, maybe more could be put in agri. In a practical way, nothing that's too long-term, nothing that people can't catch up on in this forum. How would you invest and dramatically shift agri next year where you could see a growth spur, like a growth? Instead of, let's say, of a 1-2% growth 2021, you could see, let's say, a 5% growth in agri. What would you do?
May I answer that, Karen?
Yes, sir.
Yeah. I think land area-wise, in the lowlands, I think we've already reached the limits. That's why in my presentation, I was proposing that we start developing the uplands in a very sustainable way. That's why we need to start terracing the uplands, put the water catchments, fish ponds there, and so forth, because it can also help in the lowlands by reducing the flooding during the heavy rains. Because as we catch the water in the uplands, it will also reduce the flooding in the lowlands. Second, we have about 15 million hectares available. Maybe if we just develop even 1/3 of that, that's 5 million hectares. At let's say 100 pesos per square meter, that's easily worth 5 trillion pesos worth of development. In other words, it is wealth that we can tap on later on. In other words, I'm proposing that if we even mobilize the military with heavy equipment to start developing the uplands, put in the gabion dams, put in the water catchments, start terracing, so it can be developed in a very sustainable manner. That way we expand our agricultural area. At the same time, we invest heavily in agriculture. Plus, we spend in the rural areas, which we need badly. And that can induce migration back to the rural areas if there's a lot of economic activity because of these projects. Second, Karen, is the mangroves rehabilitation and fish sanctuaries and patrolling the fish sanctuaries. When I was in Bohol, when I was in NEDA, I visited Inabanga river system and the mangroves that they planted there, the fish catch from 1.5 kilos per fisherman. He was able to increase it to 8 kilos per fisherman. In other words, big income. And I saw the prawns there, they were huge. They could fill a big bandejado. And I saw them start growing talaba and tahong because now the mangroves were making the marine life thrive. In other words, there's plenty of opportunities in agriculture, but it has to be on the supply side, not just spending, but spend it wisely in investments. That's why uplands, do terracing, start replanting the terraces with forage trees and forage crops. Do water catchments and gabion dams to limit the water flow and keep it in the uplands so they can be made more productive. In the sea, to do mangrove replanting. Mangroves are the highest carbon capture. They will capture more than a forest on a per hectare basis. Very efficient capturing carbon. Second, as I said, you can increase fisherman's catch to 1.5 kilo per day. It's a big quantum jump in a fisherman's income. This will have a lot of impact on our environment. We can reduce the flooding to the lowlands. We can reforest the uplands, and we can also generate a lot of income and expand our agricultural base. That's why I'm very bullish about agriculture. That's why Shell is also bullish about it. And I think our new secretary now, William Dar, has a lot of good ideas. I hate to say it, but our previous DA secretaries were political appointees. Finally, I think we have now a very good professional DA secretary. I think he's on the right track. Thank you.
All right, Professor Shell, maybe you'd like to add something. A simple question. What would you do, practically speaking, using the 2021 budget to really see an incremental growth in the agricultural sector next year?
Well, I've heard our national scientist, Dr. Emil Javier, argue for just one simple thing: fertilization. Of course, I hope it doesn't go into a fertilizer scam type of program, wherein the fertilizer to be delivered is water practically. But anyway, fertilization is very important because that alone will already lead to a tremendous jump in productivity of our farms. The other thing I want to highlight is irrigation, especially because irrigation in the past seems to have been thought to be simply for rice. And yet, in going around our farms, our countryside, you see a lot of other things in dire need of more irrigation, including these high-value crops, including sugarcane. Wherein, in one anecdote in Iloilo, a sugarcane farmer was told the only way he can get access to the irrigation water from the new Halaur Dam was to shift to rice from sugarcane. It's ridiculous. So we simply have to look at irrigation as something needed by all crop sectors, especially those that are now being given attention to after we take away our inordinate obsession with rice. And so this is now something that Secretary Dar is very much aware of. So again, I affirm what Romy said. In fact, I was part of a white paper of my think tank Brain Trust, which said, among other things, we have to shift upland. We have to shift more inland because of sea level rise in climate change. But you also have to shift outside to the waters because there's so much that we have yet that remain untapped in both sides, and at the same time insulate ourselves from climate change.
Okay. Jaime Avila has a question. This is to all the panelists, and we don't have enough time, but he says, I don't think that the questions that have been submitted are being addressed. All right. So let me just open the chat box here. Okay. So that you can address these questions. Jaime, let me pick some questions and pick one person. Okay. Fred Parungao, is there a master plan or a blueprint by government in achieving economic recovery? ASEC Tony Lambino, I think you need to take that quickly.
Okay, DG Diwa already included it in his presentation. Actually, there was the 4-pillar strategy that was announced early on, even in the midst of the early weeks of the pandemic, and we are implementing that 4-pillar strategy. Now we're on the 4th pillar, which is the economic recovery, which includes the stimulus, which includes the access to credit, which includes the credit guarantees, which includes the ability to infuse equity into companies that are experiencing insolvency issues. And there's also, of course, the amendments to the Agri-Agri law that we discussed earlier. So yes, all of those things come together under the 4-pillar strategy. Emergency support, improving our healthcare capacity, making sure that monetary and fiscal policies are both supportive of the recovery and the economic recovery program.
Okay. Is it fair to say quickly lang, Asek Tony, when it comes to the economic recovery, the architect would really be the economic team, meaning Finance Secretary Sunny Dominguez?
Well, it is the mandate of the Economic Development Cluster, which Secretary Dominguez is the chair of. So yes, the economic team has been working very closely together with BSP as an advisor, actually. In that
okay. What is the strategy quickly to attract foreign direct investments, which have been declining? Let's start with the short-term program for next year. That's question of Daniel Agustin.
Well, this year we should pass CREATE, which I described a little bit earlier. And then as CREATE is being implemented, we really change the way in which we try to attract investors. Because what we've been doing is we have a menu and then we wait for them to come. We can't do that anymore. Now we have to target the industries, the subsectors that will bring the best jobs here to the Philippines, and then package an incentive and a set of incentives, fiscal and non-fiscal, which CREATE will allow, and really bring those super investments to the country.
Okay. A question from Daniel for Dr. Habito, just quickly. Is it a good policy if we follow Japan, which has high-tech fishing ships?
Well,
this is because our waters is larger than our land resource.
Yes, indeed. I mean, generally, and in fact, as Neri was also pointing out, there's still a lot of scope for improvement and expansion in the wealth that we are able to get from fisheries, both in capture fisheries and also especially in aquaculture and mariculture, meaning aquaculture on the seas or on salt water. But indeed, technology would have a very important role, and to the extent that we can make open sea fishing much more effective and efficient through the high tech that is being alluded to that used in Japan. Certainly, there's a lot that we can gain from that.
Okay, just to close, maybe to give our participants something to hope for. Asek, does the economic team have a target of, let's say, growth? I mean, we've seen contractions this 2020, but are you hopeful that, what's the target for growth next year?
The numbers were estimated and released, but I think we should wait for the new data to come in before we discuss it in earnest, because there's new data coming in next week. The labor force survey, for instance, is coming in. The GDP numbers are being constantly evaluated. So let's, if you don't mind, let the Development Budget Coordinating Committee approve a new set of estimates. But yes, we are looking at growth next year. That is certainly still on the table.
All right. Well, on that note, I'd like to thank all of you for today's forum. And Jimmy, are you still there, Jimmy?
Yes, Karen,
right.
thank you very
Jimmy,
much for coming back.
No, but you could have handled this yourself. Thank you so much, Jimmy. Thank you. We could do this together next time.
We're deeply honored to have you with us again. So thank you again for moderating today's session. And to all the speakers and panelists, thank you very much for gracing this occasion today. We are now ready to formally close this summit, but we'd like to ask our President of SharePHIL and Chairman of CIBI Foundation, Mr. Fred Parungao, to give his closing remarks. Thank you again, everyone. Fred?
Thank you. Thank you, Jimmy. Good afternoon. In behalf of the organizers, the Shareholders Association of the Philippines, and the CIBI Foundation, Inc., and our participating organizations, I would like to thank you for attending and actively participating in this webinar. I would like to thank our distinguished Keynote Speaker, Department of Finance Assistant Secretary Mr. Antonio Lambino, and the members of the panel, former BSP Deputy Governor Diwa Guinigundo, former NEDA Secretary Dr. Cielito Habito, and former SSS President Romulo Neri, for sharing with us your most valuable and insightful ideas on this very important subject on economic recovery for the country. Our attendees greatly benefited from your presentation. It is evident that there is indeed light at the end of the tunnel, but the work is long and hard. We must have good leadership, we must have a good plan, and we must work together hand in hand as a people to achieve economic recovery. Our sincerest thanks also go to Ms. Karen Davila for moderating the question and answer period, and also to Mr. Jimmy Ismael for being the master of ceremonies and also partly the moderator. We wish everyone the best. May God bless our country. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Fred. Ladies and gentlemen, that ends our second summit. We hope you found the discussions insightful and useful. And again, thank you all for participating and have a pleasant afternoon. Thank you.